Let's talk about depth as a criterion that any undergraduate writer working on an essay about literature should keep in mind. This lecture is a somewhat extended version of what is already included in my one-page handout on depth, also copied at my webpage on depth where this video is embedded and where you may be watching this. Feel free to follow along with those as I talk. If you've received feedback from professors saying things like, go deeper, dig deeper, more, too much summary, obvious, shallow, superficial, or anything regarding lack of analysis or depth of analysis, then this is a criterion that likely requires your attention. Know the difference between a report and an argument. What is the difference? The purpose of a report, that is a review or a lecture or an encyclopedic entry, is usually to inform the reader about their subject, right? So you see in even critical reviews of books or movies, you see a good deal of summary in those, right? And then opinion expressed on top of those. That's the report part. Again, usually what your prof will be doing in lecture involves a lot of reportage. That is not what we're asking for usually in an essay from you. A report may call for a breadth of information, a general summary of the subject, a rundown of the most prominent work on that subject, a lesson in large-scale historical contexts, major motifs, major themes, and an array of related points of interest, perhaps. But none of those items has any place, usually, in an undergraduate argumentative academic essay in the humanities. Because there's only so much space or time to work with, material included to provide breadth does so necessarily at the expense of depth. That's true in lectures too. Lectures can only go as deep as they fail to go broad, and the opposite is true. In an argumentative essay, the argument becomes shallow as a result of adding breadth, with too little room to achieve the requirements of the assignment. If you've included items that add to breadth at the expense of depth in your argumentative essay, that will not only ruin your argument, but it will also signal to your reader that you have failed to understand what an argument is, what a logical argument is, at a fundamental level. So dig. If you think of each word of your thesis as one shovelful, one chance to dig, to put your shovel into the ground and pull out dirt, you get a limited number of chances to dig, of shovelfills, into a particular subject. So that since your goal is to dig as deeply as possible, it would be advisable to you to keep digging down in the same place rather than to dig across a field. So what do? Well, let's start at level B1. I'm using a sort of basement level metaphor. The lower down we go, the better. At level B1, let's call that obvious. Here, your thesis describes the topic, and when I say thesis, remember, I'm talking about the thing that your thesis statement summarizes, right? So your thesis is the entirety of your essay. It is the argument that causes your essay to come into being. Here in my examples, I'll be giving examples of thesis statements that would be attached to the essays that make these arguments. So at level B1, the obvious thesis. Your thesis describes the topic, gives facts, makes an observation. This level of thesis is obvious. It's non-controversial. That is, no reasonable person would disagree with what this kind of thesis says, and the thesis is not interesting enough for anyone to bother to try. A person reading a level B1 thesis thinks, yes, that's true. Note, you have to pass through level B1 in order to dig deeper. Here, let's look at some examples, actually, of level B1 theses. One might be about, let's go with Prometheus Bound and Paradise Lost as my examples here. Level B1 thesis for Prometheus Bound. In their translation of Prometheus Bound, Scully and Harrington, the two translators we're talking about, Scully and Harrington break up the metrical and aesthetic symmetry of Aeschylus's poetic lines. Yes, they do. That's not something you can really argue, but that's what they do. It's an obvious thesis, right? Or, in Paradise Lost, Milton layers different narrative voices on top of each other. Yes, correct. That's not a thesis, right? I can't tell you how many undergraduate theses, even at the university level, are at this level of shallowness sometimes that I get. Now, it's important to say here, again, as I said before, you have to pass through the obvious, pass through level B1 in order to get to lower levels. That is, you must be able to articulate the most obvious denotative readings of your subject. right? You have to be able to say this, and I would recommend looking at the clarity and rigor pages for more about what I mean about that. You have to be able to state the obvious in order to move past it, but you state it briefly. You must be able to articulate the most obvious denotative readings of your subject, but those readings should take up very little of your final draft. Make a passing reference or two to situate your argument in relation to what seems pretty obvious. The best way to determine what is obvious is, of course, by referring to prior scholarship, and on that, you should refer to the innovation page. So, you've stated the obvious briefly. You've situated very briefly where you begin. The next step is what underlies that. Level B2, the reasonable. I'll look at some examples of that first, I think. Reasonable theses. In their translation of Prometheus Bound, Scully and Harrington break up the metrical and aesthetic symmetry of Aeschylus's poetic lines, which emphasizes the violence translators must do to their source texts, and the meaning inevitably lost in the process. Or, in Paradise Lost, Milton layers different narrative voices on top of each other, complicating the truth value of any narrative statement. Yeah. Okay. At level B2, the reasonable, your thesis interprets, gives a point of view on, and/or reveals some controversy or contradiction, something worth arguing, beneath the plain facts of level B1, right? You'll notice each of these thesis statement examples, better to say, starts with a level B1 semi-obvious statement and goes beneath into interpretive, what's going on there, right? It's a thing to be argued, a position which a reasonable person could and would bother to disagree with. A person reading a B2 thesis thinks, that's an interesting take on what I already knew, but I hadn't thought about much. Now, when I say something controversial here, right, by controversy, I do not mean that this thesis should be absurd or radical or idiosyncratic, right, seeking to provoke controversy for the sake of controversy. Rather, I mean taking a position, ideally an innovative position, that might be opposed to other reasonable positions, that can be opposed to another position. The level B1 theses could not be opposed to anything. You can't say, to take the example of what I mean here, you can't say, no one would argue in Paradise Lost, Milton does not layer different narrative voices on top of each other. It's evident, right? It might be the topic of a high school paper at an early level, but not for you, right? And then at the level of reasonable, we say, in Paradise Lost, Milton layers different narrative voices on top of each other, complicating the truth value of any narrative statement. We're getting somewhere there, right? So this level of argument is generally where high school training, particularly for standardized tests, stops digging, right? This is sort of the best you're expected to do. It is not the best you're expected to do here, not at university. You want to reach level B3 at least deep. And if you look at some of the highest level writing, academic writing published by professors, you'll see that we, if we're doing our jobs, we're going to even deeper levels, right? But in a short undergraduate essay, get to level B3, what I would call deep. Again, you must pass through levels B1 and B2 to get here, right? Again, see the clarity and rigor pages for that. But let's look at these examples. In their translation of Prometheus Bound, Scully and Harrington break up the metrical and aesthetic symmetry of Aeschylus's poetic lines, which emphasizes the violence translators must do to their source texts and the meaning inevitably lost in the process. By the time Hermes establishes Zeus's power over how the events of the play will be shaped into a linear but partial history, the modern translators have aligned themselves with Zeus as the torturers and controllers of Prometheus, and as fatally subject to a temporality they cannot grasp. I should have emphasized that the modern translators have aligned themselves with Zeus as the torturers and controllers of Prometheus and as fatally subject to a temporality they cannot grasp. Or for Paradise Lost, in Paradise Lost, Milton layers different narrative voices on top of each other, complicating the truth value of any statement, including necessarily his own narrative voice. Thus, the parallels he draws between his poetic voice and God's are inseparable from those drawn between his poetic project and Satan's ambition, right? Those are, I think, in a good place for, say, undergraduate essays, potentially. Could do better, but sufficiently deep, I think. Here you are looking at level B3 for the key structures, which are often themselves controversies or contradictions, that underlie level B2, on which level B2 relies for support. At level B3, you show how revealing the structures that underlie a reasonable argument Expose something about that reasonable argument, about levels B1 and B2. You try to shift those structures in order to see how B2 and B1 will change shape in order to better understand how the structures are currently built. Level B3 is the most difficult level of thesis to describe in this kind of lecture because a full essay would be required to think it through. In order to make these two cases, you would take a full 5-ish page essay to explain how this is true, to make this case, right? That's usually why it's the main requirement for a high grade on a university essay assignment. The reader of a B3 thesis would say, yeah, I never thought of it that way and will never see this familiar subject the same way again. You have enriched, challenged, or troubled my understanding. Or the reader of a B3 thesis will say, I'm actually not convinced of your final point, but you make a fascinating case on the way. That's fair too, right? These are the thesis statements. These two thesis statements I presented are not enough. They're not self-evident. They're not even on their own plainly reasonable. I would have to make the case for each of these things using an essay, and I'd say the amount of case I'd have to make for each of these points would be about 5 pages long, right? So a B3 thesis statement is at least a paragraph long. It's at this point that I have a lot of students say, okay, but how do I get to level B3? And I'll say, it's literally in the handout and in the talk. Look for the key structures. It's repeating what I just said. Because I get asked to repeat it a lot. Look for the key structures, often themselves controversies or contradictions, that underlie level B2, on which level B2 relies for support. A B3 thesis shows how revealing those structures that underlie B2 expose something about level B2 or B1, and try to shift those structures in order to see how B2 and B1 change shape. Let me give you a shorter but less thorough way to articulate what that might be. Right? Figure out what premises are necessary, what given premises have been necessary for you to have argued what you have argued so far. So take a look at the B2 argument that you've made and say, what given premises have I taken for granted in order to make that argument? And be thorough. What have I rested upon? And then let them not be given premises anymore. Figure out what needs to be done to prove that what you've taken as true are true. That's not the right. So ask, what assumptions allowed me to articulate my argument in the first place, right? It's not the only way to go deeper, but it's usually a good start, right? What assumptions have allowed me to articulate my reasonable argument in the first place? And as you do so, and this is redundant with the complexity lecture as well, read against the grain. This is important, so I'll repeat it here too. If you cut wood against the natural alignment of its fibers, you end up with rough edges. Rough edges are vital to literary analysis, right? So when you cut wood, if you cut it with the grain, the edge that you get is smooth. That's great for furniture making. It's bad for literary analysis. To read against the grain, a term, right, for literary analysis, in order to go deep, you need to rough things up. You need to break up the dirt so you can dig into it, right? To read against the grain, which is a term coined by David Bartholomew and Anthony Petrosky, one, you find the grain of the work, the way it seems to want to be read, the thing its author function sets out to do. 2, you challenge that smooth implicit reading, revealing its inherent contradictions, controversies, contingencies, and paradoxes, and then you break those apart. You ask, does a text do what it seems to set out to do? That's the first step, right? You're at level B1 and you say, does a text do what it seems to set out to do? And then you get to level B2 and you say, okay, so maybe it doesn't do what it seems to set out to do, or maybe it sort of does it, but in a complicated way. What does a text doing or not doing what it seems to set out to do? What does that do? And then if you really want to go deeper, as you should, how does that thing that it does, that is the thing that a poem does by doing or not doing what it seems to set out to do or not do what it does? I know that that's complicated as hell, and that's the point. How does the thing that a poem, and I'm saying poem, it should be text actually. How does the thing that a text does? How does the thing that the text does by doing or not doing what it seems to set out to do or not do what it does? And that's a very, very overly succinct compression of what I mean by reading against the grain. This is not the same thing as identifying irony or ambiguity. In fact, irony and ambiguity usually offer the smoothest grains of all, right? We tend to be moved cleverly along to see ironies and ambiguities by clever writers. In fact, look for right? When an author function seems most clearly to do the, see what I did there? Or those moments when everyone in class seems to agree about and be dazzled by something, but you're not convinced. Get it? And finally, to sum it all up, paper length. Let's talk about paper length and word limits. You should not be able to sum up your thesis off the top of your head, right? I see so many times students come in and they're like, I think my thesis is going to be, and they say it off the top of their head. A level B3 thesis considers its subject in such depth that a full essay would be required to articulate it. And thus, you have your hypothesis, you write the essay to thoroughly articulate that hypothesis, letting the hypothesis change as you begin to articulate it, and then having articulated it, you go back and you summarize what you have articulated, which will sound like but not be identical to your hypothesis, and that's your thesis statement. And that is the point of an essay, right? The essay is the real estate that's required to convincingly, compellingly, and thoroughly express whatever argument you set out to make. If there's a simpler way to get to the final point you make, you have to do that, right? See the economy page for that. So if you can say what you have to say, if you can get to your point more simply, cut back, right? Get to things as simply as you can. And that'll clear space for you to dig deeper from there, right? That's a great way to think about the final drafting and editing stages on your paper. So you so you draft, then you economize to clear out space. You've cleared out, half the space, and then you deepen and complexify to fill that space back up. And then you see what you've written and you economize again. Then you deepen and complexify again. Economize, deepen and complexify. Economize and then deepen and complexify until you truly cannot cut back anymore. You cannot economize anymore because you are using every inch of your word count toward your argument. When you can't cut anything anymore without sacrificing clarity, then you've necessarily gone into as much depth as your word count will allow. Continually asking, well, what underlies that? What underlies that? Exploring the ramifications, exploring the underlying structures. If you really are truly doing that, but you're doing it in as simple and straightforward wording as possible, not being at all uneconomical, then you have necessarily exploited the fullness of your word count to go as deeply as possible, right? You've narrowed its breadth and are going as deeply as possible. In short, the length of the assignment, your word count, your paper length, is what determines how deep your thesis can go. Your thesis should be deep enough to require the fullness of your word count to explain and defend. So if you fill that up with extra wordage, the degree to which you do that, or if you fill that up with extra breadth, the degree to which you do that is the degree to which you are failing to reach the maximum depth that your word count can reach, which is a no-no. So to get to depth, right, when your essay is truly identical to the thesis, right, when your essay does nothing more than express a thesis, then you have used as much depth as you can. So the first step to getting to depth is economy, is to cut back, is focus, right, is to remove things that are redundant or unnecessary. And then you dig as deeply into that as you can until you run out of space. And that's how deep you need to go.